One of my more hard-coded memories was of a cold winter night. The night that my folks got me Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. It was nice. I enjoyed the exploration, but when I reached Goma for the first time, I was too much of a scaredy cat to play the game for at least a few months. Damn spiders! I wouldn't say that I'm a massive Zelda fan. I enjoy the series a lot. I've played a good portion of the games, with Twilight Princess being one of my favorites. For, no real reason. And if you haven't been under a rock for the last few weeks, we finally got Tears of the Kingdom, and frankly, I like the game a lot. For no real reason. As you can probably tell by the title and topic, today's video will be talking a fair bit about the old Zelda franchise, as well as its old gaming conventions. To be completely serious, I do enjoy the new open world aspects of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. Hell, Tears seems like a much better upgrade in some aspects to Breath of the Wild, one of the biggest being that they actually did something different with the bosses, not only with design work, but how they actually fight too. Like, they're actually unique in design and have a lot more variety to them, yet still have a cohesive design element with the eyes. Also, not to give too much of a spoiler, but the final boss actually requires some level of skill. So, yay! However, and this is something I've been thinking about for quite a while now, especially since some games are starting to adopt the Breath of the Wild open world methodology, as well as Tears of the Kingdom now adding, well...
Not yet, Snake! It's not over yet!
Hey, I'm not going to complain about having a giant mech suit, but the more and more we break the traditions of the Zelda franchise, I can't help but feel nostalgic for the older titles. And I know, I sound like an old man in the room complaining about how Zelda isn't like it was in the good old days back when I had to go to school in 5 deep snow. Everyone point and laugh at the walking corpse now. Joke's on you, I have a good conversation with the zombies in the graveyard, even if they can be a bit grabby at times. And apparently are giant moths now. But hear me out for about 10-15 minutes, and we'll see if you can still disagree with me. Funnily enough, the original Legend of Zelda brought out the bare bones of what could be considered the Zelda Formula. If you're not familiar with the concept of the Zelda Formula, and I would imagine that there are people who are like that given the last couple games deviated from it, allow me to explain. The best way to describe the formula is as such. Explore the overworld to find a dungeon. Acquire items in the dungeon. Dungeon item unlocks new areas of the overworld, and doing so allows there to be more exploration, and you repeat the process. It's a nice formula, but one that a lot of games use. It's a basic gameplay loop that incentivizes the player to explore and experiment with the tools they're given in the dungeons. Granted, I will say at times the tools in and of themselves are a pretty big giveaway on what you need to do, especially with the bosses. Oh, I got a giant hammer. Better slam the hammer down on the giant lava dragon's head to win. A prime example is when you're in Ocarina of Time and you manage to get your big boy pants, and the first temple you actually can go to, the Forest Temple, requires you to find a tool to get in, and the hookshot is you essentially grave robbing at your best. I feel like I should also point out that in the older Legend of Zeldas, progress is more diegetic as opposed to statistical gains. What I mean to say is, once you got a bow and could shoot arrows, instead of becoming stronger in a numerical sense, you gained a new way of attacking as well as solving puzzles. There was a progression of Link becoming stronger, not because the numbers said he would, but because his tool belt kept on expanding as you played the game. Now all we need is some moblin repellent and we're all good here. The tools you used also had other effects when it came to combat too. Sticking with Ocarina of Time, the boomerang you got as a kid would paralyze your enemies. There was a progression on how you got stronger. Then we get to Breath of the Wild and suddenly things change. Weapons break. Most of the specified tools in previous games don't exist, and in all honesty, with the exception of the beginning abilities in Paraglider, everything else in the game is optional. The key difference is freedom, since the point of Breath of the Wild, and by extension Tears of the Kingdom, is exploration and freedom. There are people out there who are capable of fighting Ganon in nothing but their underwear, an old shield, and a stick. And they have my utmost respect for that. I do want to point out that I'm not saying Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom are bad games, far from it. This is mostly to talk about how I feel that the more traditional Zelda games are being phased out, with Breath of the Wild gameplay design being focused on. It's not bad, but it's different. Item crafting, weapon stats and durability, building giant mechs, torturing Koroks, and throwing bombs at innocent civilians is a fun time. And I'm sure there are people who are going to bring up that this isn't the first time that Zelda has broken the formula, like with Triforce Heroes or Four Swords. Legit, I've seen people saying that if you haven't played these games, you really can't comment on what is and isn't the Zelda formula. Gatekeeping at its finest, folks. And to that I have to say, that's really short-sighted, especially considering that these styles of gameplay didn't really catch on, unlike Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Majora's Mask, a game that is beloved to this very day, has the elements of the older Zelda theory, but also played with the formula as well without changing the core elements of it. It just had more of a focus on side quests and NPCs. But Majora's Mask still had dungeons that were quite different from each other, each had their own identity and didn't really blend together in design. Not to mention their bosses, for better or worse, all had uniqueness to them, and even incorporated the mask system in order to defeat a majority of them. Breath of the Wild didn't exactly have that, with the bosses essentially being a different flavor of the same enemy with a different elemental aspect to the 4 blights. Tears of the Kingdom, however, did manage to overcome this, as I've stated earlier, and I greatly appreciate that. But I don't know, even when I'm playing Tears of the Kingdom and exploring the temples in the sky and going through the depths, I don't really feel the same vibe I get when I was going through a dungeon in older Zelda games. I think this stems from a differentiation between the linear and freedom-based game design philosophy. Now, I'm not saying that Skyward Sword's backlash for its linear pacing of the story was what prompted Breath of the Wild, but I wouldn't say that's a bad bet either. It seems like a lot of linear games have faded away or turned into more open-world games. Hell, look at Pokemon's attempts, and people have said that Pokemon's trying to emulate the Breath of the Wild style. I mean, they at least tried. Ugh. But with Tears of the Kingdom finally being released and people going gaga over it, I wonder if we'll actually get another linear Zelda game. And I'm sure some people are already lifting the pitchforks and torches, prepared to put me on a spit like I was a Korok. Freedom. Freedom is something that a lot of gamers have been wanting to experience in games. After all, one of the best things about games is to lose yourself in the world. You can become someone you're not. You can become a hero. And with Tears of the Kingdom allowing players to really experiment with the fusion ability, as well as breaking the game, creating monstrosities to ravage the land and terrorize the monsters, it's very appealing.
Now this is pod racing!
And yet, I miss the moments in older games. I miss rolling in Snowhead Temple as a Goron and ramming into the giant mechanical bull monster. I miss riding on a Beyblade, bouncing left and right on the walls, slamming into a giant skeleton. I miss the progression of a dungeon. Breath of the Wild really had discrete, individual physics puzzles in the shrines, and single dungeon gimmicks shared across the great beasts. To be frank, the temples in Tears of the Kingdom actually improved upon that aspect as well. There are somewhat puzzles, and each are rather unique from each other, especially with the addition of the companions that you can get with your adventures on this. But that being said, like how it was an issue in Breath of the Wild, there really isn't progression through the temples, since you're still using the abilities you're given before entering the temple, not the ones you acquire within the temple. Maybe it's just me, but I miss having the ability to get new tools to really help in various kinds of exploration. And while I just complimented the temples in Tears of the Kingdom for being an improvement from the divine beasts in Breath of the Wild, having played the water, fire, and air temples again, I found them to be rather simplistic. Back in Breath of the Wild, we had an ability called Rivali's Gale. It was an ability that you unlocked that allowed you to essentially create a gust of air propelling you into the sky. I bring this up because I feel like a lot more interesting concepts like this to improve exploration by having similar elements incorporated into dungeons would work better. Imagine if we had an ability that was unlocked that was the reverse of Ascend, allowing you to go through platforms beneath you. Or if you're able to unlock an item that was similar to that of the Claw Shot, which would allow you to scale the walls faster, but couldn't be used on walls while climbing. It's pretty easy to include items and abilities that could be used to help traverse the world of Tears of the Kingdom, and maybe allow some additional perks to completing the dungeons and side quests. And I know there are people who are going to bring up the outfits, how they improve the game and they add status effects to Link and give him abilities, or how people will bring up the stage's abilities. However, I would disagree that they're the same thing as what I've described. Yes, things like the Froggy armor and the Glider armor do help out with exploration, but they aren't the same thing as to what I'm talking about. And the only stage ability that really helps with exploration is Tulin, although you can also argue that Yumbo can destroy rocks and ore nodes, but that's not so much exploration as its utility for breaking stone ores and attacking. Look, I enjoy rolling around at the speed of sound as much as the next guy, but it's not really akin to what I was hoping for when it comes to classic Zelda. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I don't appreciate the changes that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom bring. If anything, I appreciate the assets that it brings to the table. But when it comes to classic Zelda and game design, I don't know, I find myself drifting back to the good old days when there was more of a linear story path. Not only because of the game design where more time and care can be put into each individual dungeon, as well as the tools you can find in said dungeon, but also from a story perspective. If you follow a linear progression, you can emphasize individual characters, create deeper nuances within the plot, and truly make the player feel like they are part of a greater story. No one really plays Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom for the story, from what I understand. They play for the gameplay, they play to mess around, or they play because they like riding Sidon. Truly, you were the best steed in all of Hyrule, Sidon. Both gameplay styles have their merits, both have their weaknesses, and the point of this video isn't to say that one style is better than the other. That's the last thing I'm trying to say. Maybe I'm getting a little too deep into that graveyard that I brought up earlier. I mean, some of the people in that place tend to have better conversation than people on Twitter, but I can't help but miss that some of the previous gaming trends that I grew up with. And sure, there's the indie scene where a lot of games are coming out with design elements from previous games that I grew up loving. One in particular in which seeming takes a lot of elements from handheld Zelda is Mina the Hollower. Then again, this is Yacht Club Games. They're known for their quality of games and keeping to past gaming traditions, so I'm not exactly worried there. But there's still something about one of the pillars of game design changing so drastically and possibly not returning to what made this series all that enthralling, at least to me. Oh well, I'm just a professional guy with opinions on the internet, and I think I'll go back to making mech suits and Tears of the Kingdom and sip my mecha goat waifu now. But don't let my opinion be the only one here. I want to hear what your guys' thoughts are, so long as you don't act like this guy if someone doesn't want to engage with you. I'm more than willing to hear you guys' thoughts on this matter. Personally speaking, I think a good blend between Breath of the Wild style and old school Zelda can be achieved. We saw a glimpse of that in Tears of the Kingdom, but that's just my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm MangaKamen, and remember to watch your distance before you blow things up.